In 1739, a Scottish philosopher wrote a single paragraph that would become one of the most debated passages in the history of ethics. David Hume, just 28 years old, proposed something so simple it seemed almost trivial, yet so profound that philosophers are still wrestling with it nearly 3 centuries later. You cannot derive what ought to be from what is. The claim appears innocent enough at first glance. Of course, facts and values are different. Everyone knows that knowing how things are does not automatically tell us how they should be. But Hume was not merely pointing out a difference. He was identifying a logical chasm, an unbridgeable divide between two fundamentally distinct kinds of claims about the world. On one side, everything we can observe, measure, and verify about reality. On the other, every judgment about goodness, duty, virtue, and moral obligation. Between them, Hume suggested, there exists no valid logical bridge. This insight, now known as Hume's guillotine or the is-ought problem, would shatter centuries of moral philosophy built on the assumption that ethics could be derived from nature, reason, or divine command. It challenged theologians who believed moral laws could be read from scripture or natural law. It undermined rationalists who thought moral truths were as demonstrable as mathematical theorems. It opened questions that remain unresolved. If morality cannot be derived from facts about the world, where does it come from? If we cannot reason our way from what is to what ought to be, is moral discourse even rational? Tonight, we will explore this philosophical divide in its full depth and complexity. We will trace how Hume arrived at his insight, examine the radical implications it carried for ethics and religion, and follow its reverberations through 3 centuries of philosophical thought. We will encounter the attempts to solve it, dissolve it, or circumvent it entirely, and discover why each solution remains contested. By the end, you will understand why this seemingly simple observation continues to haunt every attempt to ground morality in nature, reason, or science. The passage itself appears in Book 3 of a Treatise of Human Nature, Hume's youthful masterwork of philosophy, published when most scholars were still establishing their careers. The book was Hume's attempt to do for moral philosophy what Isaac Newton had done for natural philosophy, establish it on firm empirical foundations through careful observation of human nature. The treatise was ambitious, systematic, and in Hume's own later judgment, a failure. It fell, he wrote, dead born from the press. Yet buried within its 3rd book was a paragraph that would outlive all of Hume's other contributions. Here is what Hume actually wrote. He had been discussing various systems of morality, noting how philosophers typically establish the existence of God or make observations about human affairs, and then suddenly shift from propositions connected with is and is not to propositions connected with ought and ought not. The change, Hume observed, is imperceptible but carries immense consequences. For how, he asked, can this new relation of ought be deduced from relations that are entirely different from it? Hume suggested that attending to this point would subvert all the vulgar systems of morality and show that moral distinctions cannot be derived from reason alone. The passage is brief, almost offhand, tucked into a longer discussion of moral reasoning. Hume himself may not have fully recognized the devastation this observation would cause. He moved on quickly, spending far more pages developing his positive account of morality as grounded in sentiment and sympathy rather than reason. But that single paragraph opened a crack in the foundation of moral philosophy that would widen into a chasm. What made the insight so powerful was its simplicity. Hume was not deploying complex metaphysics or obscure terminology. He was pointing out something about the basic logic of moral reasoning that everyone could recognize once they saw it. Consider any moral argument: murder is wrong, therefore you should not kill; lying causes harm, therefore you ought to tell the truth; pleasure is desirable, therefore we should pursue happiness. Each argument attempts to move from a factual premise to a moral conclusion, but the conclusion contains something the premise does not: a normative claim, a prescription, an ought. How did it get there? The problem becomes clearer when you try to construct a valid logical argument with only descriptive premises and a prescriptive conclusion. From the fact that humans are social animals, does it follow that we ought to cooperate? From the observation that most people prefer happiness to suffering, can we conclude that we ought to maximize happiness? Each inference seems to smuggle in a hidden normative premise that we ought to act according to our nature, or that we ought to give people what they prefer. Without these additional premises, the argument fails. But if we need normative premises to derive normative conclusions, we can never ground morality purely in facts. This was the guillotine, not a blade that kills but one that severs, separating fact from value with surgical precision. And once the cut is made, philosophers have struggled ever since to stitch the two back together. The struggle matters because so much depends on bridging this divide. Natural law theorists wanted to derive moral obligations from human nature. Religious thinkers needed to show that God's commands created genuine duties. Enlightenment rationalists hoped to demonstrate that morality followed from reason as necessarily as geometry. Utilitarian reformers sought to ground ethics in observable facts about pleasure and pain. Scientific materialists today want to explain morality through evolutionary biology or neuroscience. Every one of these projects crashes against Hume's guillotine. You can describe what humans are like, what they desire, how they evolved, what their brains do when making moral judgments. But none of these facts alone can tell you what humans ought to do. To understand why this problem emerged when it did, why it took the particular form it did in Hume's work, and why it has proven so resistant to solution, we need to understand the man who identified it and the intellectual world he inhabited. We need to see how a young Scottish philosopher writing in an age of reason and revolution arrived at an insight that would permanently alter how we think about the relationship between knowledge and value, between understanding the world and knowing how to live in it. The passage itself appears near the end of the first section of Book 3 of A Treatise of Human Nature, almost as an afterthought. Hume has been arguing that moral distinctions do not derive from reason alone, that our judgments of virtue and vice emerge from sentiment rather than rational demonstration. He has challenged the notion that morality can be proven like a theorem in geometry, and then, as if noticing something in passing that troubles him, he writes this: "In every system of morality, which I have hitherto met with, I have always remarked that the author proceeds for some time in the ordinary way of reasoning, and establishes the being of a god, or makes observations concerning human affairs, when of a sudden I am surprised to find that instead of the usual copulations of propositions, is and is not, I meet with no proposition that is not connected with an ought, or an ought not. This change is imperceptible, but is, however, of the last consequence. For as this ought or ought not expresses some new relation or affirmation, it is necessary that it should be observed and explained, and at the same time that a reason should be given for what seems altogether inconceivable, how this new relation can be a deduction from others which are entirely different from it." Read it again slowly. Notice what Hume is doing. He is not constructing an elaborate argument. He is making an observation about other people's arguments. He has been reading moral philosophy, natural law treatises, theological ethics, and he has noticed something peculiar. Authors begin by describing facts, the nature of God, the structure of human psychology, the organization of society. They use the language of is and is not. They tell you what exists, how things are constituted, what human beings desire or fear, and then, almost without acknowledging the shift, they begin telling you what you ought to do, what obligations you have, what morality requires. The copula changes from is to ought, but no justification for this transition is provided. Hume calls this change imperceptible. The writer does not announce that they are making a logical leap. They glide from description to prescription, as if the move were perfectly natural, as if stating facts about God's nature or human constitution were sufficient to establish moral duties. But Hume insists the change is of the last consequence, the highest importance. The word ought expresses something entirely different from is. It introduces a new relation, a new kind of claim. And if this new relation is supposed to follow logically from the previous claims, that derivation needs to be explained. It needs to be justified, because on the face of it, Hume says, it seems altogether inconceivable how an ought statement can be deduced from statements that are entirely different in character. That is the paragraph. That is the whole of Hume's explicit statement of what would become the is-ought problem. If you were reading the Treatise when it was published in 1739, you might have passed over this passage without much notice. It appears to be a methodological aside, a reminder to philosophers to watch their inferences carefully. Hume does not dwell on it. He moves on quickly to his positive account of how moral sentiments actually work. The paragraph occupies perhaps a third of a page in a massive work spanning 3 volumes. It is tentative in tone, almost apologetic. Hume does not claim to have discovered a fatal flaw in all previous moral philosophy. He simply notes that he has always found this transition puzzling, that it seems to require explanation, and that he has not yet seen an adequate explanation given. Book 3 of the treatise, titled Of Morals, was Hume's attempt to apply his empirical method to ethics. The first 2 books had dealt with understanding and the passions. Now Hume turned to the question of how human beings make moral judgments, distinguish virtue from vice, and develop systems of obligation and duty. His central claim was radical for its time. Moral distinctions are not discovered by reason, but are the product of sentiment, of feelings of approbation and disapproval that arise naturally in human beings when they contemplate certain actions or character traits. Virtue is whatever produces in us a feeling of approval. Vice is whatever produces disapproval. Morality is not a matter of comparing ideas and detecting logical relations, as the rationalists believed, but of feeling certain emotional responses. This sentimentalist foundation is what makes the is-ought observation possible. If moral claims were rational demonstrations, as many of Hume's predecessors believed, then there would be no logical gap between is and ought. You could reason from premises about human nature to conclusions about human duty, just as you reason from mathematical premises to mathematical conclusions. But if moral claims rest on sentiment rather than reason, then they occupy a different category from factual claims. A factual claim describes how the world is. A moral claim expresses approval or disapproval, endorsement or condemnation. These are different kinds of mental acts, different kinds of utterances, and Hume's little paragraph is quietly insisting that this difference matters for logic. You cannot derive one kind of claim from another without some bridge principle, some additional premise that makes the connection. What is remarkable is that Hume seems not to have fully recognized the explosive potential of his own observation. He does not frame it as a devastating critique of natural law ethics or religious morality. He does not announce that he has uncovered a fatal flaw in centuries of moral reasoning. The paragraph appears almost as a footnote, a puzzling anomaly he has noticed but cannot quite explain. In the centuries since, philosophers have argued over whether Hume even intended to make the strong logical claim that later thinkers attributed to him. Perhaps he was simply noting a practical difficulty, a tendency of moral philosophers to be careless in their arguments. Perhaps he was pointing out a psychological puzzle about how factual beliefs give rise to moral judgments. The text itself is ambiguous enough to sustain multiple interpretations, but the philosophical community gradually came to read this passage as making a fundamental claim about logical validity, that no set of purely descriptive premises can entail a normative conclusion without at least one normative premise already included in the argument. This reading transforms Hume's tentative observation into an iron law of inference, a structural constraint on moral reasoning. Whether Hume intended this strong reading is less important than the fact that the paragraph, once noticed and taken seriously, proved impossible to refute or ignore. The intellectual landscape before Hume's intervention was dominated by 2 broad approaches to grounding morality. Natural law theorists, both ancient and modern, believed that moral truths could be derived from facts about human nature, the structure of the cosmos, or the will of God. Human beings have a natural end or purpose, and moral obligations follow from what conduces to that end. Divine command theorists believe that God's will constitutes the moral law, that what is right because God commands it. Rationalist ethicists like Samuel Clarke argued that moral truths are eternal relations of fitness, that reason can discern much as it discerns mathematical truths. All of these approaches assume that moral knowledge is continuous with other forms of knowledge, that the same rational faculties that tell us what is also tell us what ought to be. Hume's paragraph drives a wedge into this continuity. It suggests that the move from is to ought requires justification that these traditional approaches have not provided. It opens the possibility that moral claims are fundamentally different in kind from factual claims, that ethics occupies its own distinct domain not reducible to metaphysics, theology, or natural science. The full implications of this possibility would take generations to unfold. To understand why this paragraph mattered so much, we need to step back and understand who David Hume was, what he was trying to accomplish, and why the early 18th century was ripe for this kind of philosophical disruption. David Hume was born into a world that believed reason could solve everything. The year was 1711, and across Europe the intellectual elite spoke with confidence about natural law, divine order, and the power of rational demonstration to reveal moral truth. Into this world of certainty arrived a boy who would spend his life questioning whether reason was anywhere near as powerful as everyone assumed. He grew up in Edinburgh, Scotland, in a family of minor gentry that had seen better days. His father died when Hume was an infant, leaving the family estate of Ninewells to his older brother. For David, this meant a path through education rather than inheritance, which suited him perfectly. By his own account, he was seized by a passion for literature and philosophy before he was out of childhood. His family, hoping for something more practical, pushed him toward law. He lasted only a few months before abandoning it entirely. The dry formalism of legal studies could not compete with the questions that consumed him. How do we know what we know? What is the source of moral judgment? Can reason alone tell us how to live? At 15, Hume entered the University of Edinburgh, which was then becoming one of the intellectual centres of Europe. He devoured the moderns, John Locke's empiricism, which argued that all knowledge comes from experience rather than innate ideas, Isaac Newton's physics, which had shown that careful observation and mathematical reasoning could unlock nature's secrets, and the French skeptics who questioned whether certainty was possible at all. By his late teens, Hume was already formulating what he would later call his new scene of thought, a comprehensive philosophy that would do for human nature what Newton had done for the physical world. But the vision came at a cost. In 1729, when Hume was just 18, he suffered what appears to have been a nervous breakdown. He described it in a letter as a period of intense mental strain brought on by his philosophical labours. He had been trying to hold too many ideas in his mind at once, to see the whole system before working out the parts. His health collapsed. He withdrew from university life, tried various remedies, and eventually decided that what he needed was a complete change of scene. In 1734, he left Scotland for France. He settled in La Flèche, a small town in Anjou, home to a Jesuit college where René Descartes had once studied. There, living cheaply and working with furious concentration, Hume spent 3 years writing what he hoped would be his masterpiece, a treatise of human nature. He was in his early 20s, and he was attempting nothing less than a complete science of man. The work would cover epistemology, the philosophy of mind, moral philosophy, and political theory. It would show how all mental phenomena arise from experience, how reason and passion interact, and how morality is grounded not in abstract principle, but in human sentiment and sympathy. The ambition was staggering. Hume wanted to be the Newton of the moral sciences, to discover the fundamental laws that govern human thought and feeling. His method was rigorously empirical. Just as Newton had refused to speculate about the ultimate causes of gravity and focused instead on describing how bodies actually move, Hume would refuse to speculate about the ultimate nature of the self or the foundations of morality. He would observe how people actually think and feel, trace the patterns, and build his philosophy from there. This approach led him to some radical conclusions. He argued that causation is not something we perceive, but something we infer from repeated experience. We see one billiard ball strike another, and then see the second ball move, but we never actually see the causing itself. We just see one event followed by another, and our minds, through habit and custom, come to expect the second when we see the first. This was a direct challenge to rationalist philosophers who thought reason could demonstrate necessary connections in nature. Even more unsettling was Hume's analysis of the self. When he looked within through introspection, all he found was a bundle of perceptions, sensations and feelings flowing one after another. He could find no underlying substance, no permanent self that had these experiences. We are, he suggested, nothing more than collections of impressions and ideas held together by memory and association. The solid self we take for granted is a fiction, a habit of thought rather than a metaphysical reality. When Volume 1 and 2 of the Treatise appeared in 1739, Hume waited eagerly for the response. Surely a work of such originality and systematic rigor would cause a sensation. Instead, it met with near silence. In one of philosophy's more memorable laments, Hume later wrote that the book fell dead-born from the press, without reaching such distinction as even to excite a murmur among the zealots. The few reviews that did appear were dismissive or confused. The book was too long, too technical, too radical in its conclusions. Hume, at 28, had produced what he believed was a revolutionary work of genius, and the world had simply shrugged. The disappointment shaped everything that followed. Hume rewrote and simplified his ideas, producing more accessible versions. An inquiry concerning human understanding in 1748, and an inquiry concerning the principles of morals in 1751. He turned to essay writing, producing elegant pieces on politics, economics, and aesthetics that found a much wider audience. He wrote a massive history of England that became a bestseller and made him financially secure. He served as a diplomat and moved in fashionable circles in Edinburgh and London. By the end of his life, he was famous, but not primarily as a philosopher. The treatise remained largely unread, its most radical insights buried in prose that was simultaneously too subtle and too direct for its time. Yet it was in that neglected masterwork, in a single paragraph tucked into Book 3 on morals, that Hume had planted a seed that would eventually grow into one of philosophy's most persistent problems. He had noticed something about how philosophers moved from describing what is to prescribing what ought to be, and in pointing it out, he had opened a gap that would never quite close. But to understand why this mattered, we need to understand what Hume thought was actually happening when we make moral judgments. We need to see his positive account of morality, not just his skeptical demolition of rationalist ethics. Hume's empiricism and skepticism about reason were not isolated intellectual positions. They were part of a comprehensive vision of human nature that made the Aesop problem inevitable. To see why, we need to understand what Hume thought morality actually was. Hume's project required a new understanding of what moral judgment actually is. If reason could not be trusted to give us knowledge of metaphysical truths, if our understanding was limited to impressions and ideas, then where did moral knowledge come from? The answer Hume proposed was radical for its time and remains controversial today. Morality is not something we figure out through reason, it is something we feel. In Book 3 of the treatise, Hume makes a claim that sounds almost absurd at first hearing. Reason, he argues, is and ought only to be the slave of the passions. It is an arresting phrase, deliberately provocative. What Hume means is that reason by itself cannot motivate us to act. It can show us how to achieve our ends, calculate means to our goals, trace out consequences of our choices, but it cannot tell us what to pursue in the first place. That comes from somewhere else entirely, from desire, from feeling, from what Hume calls the passions. Consider a simple example. You can reason your way to understanding that a particular mushroom is poisonous. You can examine its features, compare it to known toxic species, predict what would happen if you ate it. All of this is the work of reason. But reason alone does not stop you from eating the mushroom. What stops you is the desire not to die, the aversion to pain, the fear of suffering. Without those feelings, the factual knowledge that the mushroom is poisonous would simply be an interesting piece of information, inert and motivationally impotent. This insight extends to moral judgment. When you witness cruelty and judge it wrong, what is actually happening, according to Hume, is that you are experiencing a distinctive feeling of disapproval. The judgment, "this is wrong," is not the conclusion of a rational demonstration, but the expression of a sentiment. You feel disapproval, and that feeling constitutes your moral response. Conversely, when you encounter benevolence and judge it virtuous, you are experiencing a feeling of approval, a warm sentiment of approbation. Hume develops this through his concept of sympathy, which for him is not merely feeling sorry for someone, but a mechanism by which we enter imaginatively into the feelings of others. When we observe another person's joy or suffering, we naturally resonate with their emotional state. This sympathetic response forms the foundation of moral sentiment. We approve of actions that promote human happiness because sympathy makes us feel in some measure the happiness they produce. We disapprove of cruelty because sympathy allows us to feel vicariously the pain it inflicts. This was a direct challenge to the rationalist ethics that dominated much of 17th and early 18th century philosophy. Thinkers like Samuel Clarke had argued that moral truths were eternal relations, perceivable by reason in the same way that mathematical truths are perceivable. For Clarke, saying that cruelty is wrong was like saying that 2 + 2 = 4, a truth accessible to pure rational insight, independent of human feeling. Clarke believed that reason could demonstrate moral obligations through an understanding of the fitness or unfitness of actions to circumstances. Hume thought this was fundamentally mistaken. You can reason about relations all day long, he argued, and never arrive at a single motivation to act. The rationalists confused the discovery of factual relations with the very different phenomenon of moral approval or disapproval. When we call something vicious, we are not reporting on some rational relation we have discovered. We are expressing a sentiment we have felt. The difference matters enormously. If morality were purely rational, then moral error would be a kind of intellectual mistake, like getting a math problem wrong. Correct moral education would be a matter of improving one's rational faculties. But if morality is grounded in sentiment, then moral education is about cultivating appropriate feelings, refining sympathy, developing the capacity to respond emotionally in ways that promote human flourishing. Hume is careful to avoid the conclusion that morality is therefore arbitrary. The sentiments that ground moral judgment are not random personal preferences. They are stable features of human nature, shaped by sympathy and regularized by social experience. Most human beings, in most circumstances, will feel approval for honesty and disapproval for betrayal, not because reason has demonstrated this, but because sympathy naturally inclines us toward whatever promotes social cohesion and human welfare. Yet this grounding in sentiment rather than reason creates a profound philosophical problem. If moral distinctions arise from feelings rather than rational demonstration, then moral claims are fundamentally different in kind from factual claims. A factual claim describes how the world is. A moral claim expresses how we feel about the world. These are not the same type of statement. One reports on objective features of reality. The other registers subjective responses, however universal and stable those responses might be. This is where the architecture of Hume's thought brings us inevitably to the is-ought problem. If reason deals with matters of fact and sentiment deals with matters of value, then there is no logical bridge between them. You cannot reason your way from a description of how things are to a prescription of how things ought to be, because ought belongs to the realm of sentiment, not reason. The descriptive and the normative occupy different domains of human experience. Hume himself may not have fully grasped how explosive this insight would prove. He mentions it almost in passing, a brief paragraph noting something he has observed in other moral writers, but the logic of his position makes the divide inevitable. If morality is grounded in sentiment rather than reason, then moral claims are fundamentally different in kind from factual claims. This is where the is-ought divide opens up, and we can now see the full structure of Hume's argument. If morality rests on sentiment rather than reason, if moral judgments arise from feeling rather than rational demonstration, then we face a stark question. What exactly is the relationship between factual claims about the world and moral claims about how we should act? Hume had suggested they were fundamentally different, but the full force of this difference becomes clear only when we examine the logical structure beneath his observation. This is not merely about psychology or human nature anymore. This is about validity itself, about what can and cannot follow from what in any legitimate argument. At the heart of Hume's insight lies a principle from formal logic that philosophers had understood for centuries, but somehow failed to apply rigorously to moral reasoning. In a valid deductive argument, The conclusion cannot contain concepts or terms that were not already present, at least implicitly, in the premises. If your premises tell you only about dogs and mammals, your conclusion cannot suddenly introduce claims about justice or beauty. The conclusion of a valid argument is contained within its premises. It unpacks what is already there. It does not add something entirely new. Consider a simple valid argument. All humans are mortal. Socrates is human. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. The concept of mortality was already present in the first premise. The concept of humanity was there as well. The conclusion merely applies these existing concepts to a particular case. Nothing new has been smuggled in. But now consider this argument. All humans die. Socrates is human. Therefore, you ought to treat Socrates with dignity. Something has gone wrong. The conclusion introduces a normative concept, ought, that appeared nowhere in the purely descriptive premises. The first two premises describe biological facts. The conclusion prescribes moral behavior. The gap between them is not bridged. It is simply leaped over. This is the logical form of the is-ought problem. Descriptive statements, statements about what is the case, tell us how the world happens to be. Normative statements, statements about what ought to be the case, tell us how the world should be. The two operate in different registers, and no accumulation of statements in one register can, by logic alone, generate a conclusion in the other register. You can pile up descriptive premises endlessly. You can catalogue every fact about human biology, psychology, history, and behavior. But at no point will an ought statement emerge from this pile unless you have already, quietly, inserted a normative premise somewhere in the chain. Hume's contemporaries constantly violated this logical principle, often without realizing it. A philosopher would observe that humans naturally desire happiness, that they form societies for mutual protection, that they care for their offspring. All descriptive claims. Then suddenly the argument would conclude, therefore, we ought to pursue happiness, we ought to maintain social order, we ought to care for our children. The ought appeared as if by magic, as if it had been derived from the facts, but it had not been derived at all. It had been assumed. Hidden in the argument was an unstated normative premise, something like we ought to do what is natural, or we ought to pursue what we desire. And that premise itself could not be derived from facts. It was a value judgment all along. The pattern repeats everywhere you look. People say, this is human nature, therefore we ought to act according to it. But why ought we follow nature? People say, God created us this way, therefore this is how we should live. But why ought we obey God's design? People say, these social arrangements produce the most happiness, therefore we ought to adopt them. But why ought we maximize happiness? Each time, the normative conclusion rests on a hidden normative premise. Remove that premise, and the argument collapses. The ought never actually came from the as. It was always there, concealed in the foundation. This is why Hume's observation cuts so deep. It is not that moral reasoning is impossible. It is that moral reasoning cannot proceed from facts alone. Every moral argument must begin with at least one normative premise, one statement about what matters, what has value, what we ought to care about. And that premise cannot itself be proven from facts. It must be either accepted, adopted, felt, or justified in some way other than pure logical derivation from descriptive claims about the world. The distinction between descriptive and normative statements begins to look less like a technical philosophical nicety and more like a fundamental feature of human thought itself. Descriptive statements aim to represent reality as it is. They can be true or false depending on whether they correspond to the facts. Normative statements aim to guide action, to prescribe, to evaluate. They can be apt or inapt, justified or unjustified, but their status does not depend simply on whether they correspond to how things happen to be. A normative statement can be entirely correct, even if no one follows it, just as a descriptive statement can be entirely false, even if everyone believes it. You might think this is merely a linguistic distinction, a quirk of grammar, the difference between the indicative and imperative moods. But Hume's point goes deeper. The difference is not just in how we express these claims, but in what they fundamentally are. A descriptive claim reports. A normative claim demands. A descriptive claim engages our cognitive faculties, our capacity to observe and reason. A normative claim engages our will, our capacity to value and choose. The two are not just different in form, they are different in function, in the role they play in human life. This is why attempts to dissolve the problem by showing that some descriptive words have normative connotations, or that some ought statements describe institutional facts, tend to miss the point. Yes, language is messy. Yes, the border between description and prescription can blur in ordinary speech, but the logical principle remains. If your argument purports to be a valid deduction, if you claim that the conclusion must follow from the premises, then you cannot introduce normative content that was not already there. And if it was already there, then you have not derived ought from is. You have derived ought from ought, using is statements as additional information along the way. Understanding the logical structure is one thing. Grasping why it matters is another. The implications of Hume's guillotine extend far beyond academic philosophy into the foundations of how we think about morality, religion, and human purpose. For nearly 2,000 years, European philosophy had operated under a powerful assumption that nature itself contained moral instruction. The natural law tradition, stretching from the Stoics through Aquinas to the Enlightenment's doorstep, believed you could read moral truths directly from the structure of reality. Human beings have a nature, this tradition insisted, and from that nature flows a proper function, a telos, an ought. The eye is for seeing, the ear for hearing, and human beings are for rational flourishing in community. To discover what we ought to do, we need only examine what we are. Hume's single paragraph quietly detonated beneath this entire edifice. If you cannot validly derive ought from is, then you cannot read moral imperatives from natural facts, no matter how carefully you observe them. The move from human nature to human good requires something more than observation and logic. It requires an evaluative premise that nature itself cannot supply. Consider how natural law reasoning typically proceeded. A philosopher would observe that human beings are rational animals, capable of speech and complex social cooperation. From these observations, he would conclude that humans ought to cultivate reason, that we ought to live in political community, that certain forms of life accord with our nature, while others corrupt it. The reasoning appeared seamless, even self-evident. We are rational, therefore we ought to be rational. We are social, therefore we ought to live socially. But Hume's guillotine reveals the gap. The observation that humans possess rationality is descriptive. It tells you what is the case. The conclusion that humans ought to cultivate rationality is prescriptive. It tells you what should be the case. The transition between these two claims is not logically warranted by the facts alone. You have smuggled in a value judgment that actualizing one's capacities is good, that fulfilling one's nature is what one ought to do. These are substantial moral claims, not self-evident truths derivable from the mere fact of possessing certain attributes. Thomas Aquinas, perhaps the greatest natural law theorist, had grounded his ethics in a comprehensive metaphysics. For Aquinas, everything in nature has a final cause, a purpose toward which it tends. The acorn's nature is to become an oak. The human's nature is to achieve rational fulfillment and union with God. Morality consists in acting according to this nature, moving toward this telos. Sin is the frustration of natural purpose. Virtue is its fulfillment. Hume's insight exposes the evaluative assumption buried in this reasoning. Why ought we to fulfill our nature? Why is the actualization of human capacities good? Aquinas would answer that God designed human nature with a purpose, and that purpose defines the good. But notice what has happened. We have moved from is to ought only by introducing God's intentions, God's purposes, God's design. And this is itself a normative premise, that we ought to conform to divine purposes, that God's intentions carry moral authority. The implications for religious ethics proved equally devastating. Divine command theory held that moral truths derive from God's will. What is good is what God commands. What is evil is what God forbids. This appears to ground morality in something absolute and transcendent beyond human opinion or cultural variation. God's word provides the ought that pure nature cannot. Yet Hume's guillotine cuts here too. Consider the structure of the argument. God exists and has issued certain commands. These are factual claims, statements about what is the case. From these, the divine command theorist concludes, therefore we ought to obey God's commands. But this conclusion does not follow from the premises alone. You have introduced a normative claim that God's commands are morally binding, that divine will creates moral obligation. Why should God's commands obligate us? Because God is our creator. But from the fact that something created you, it does not logically follow that you ought to obey it, because God is all-powerful. But might does not make right. The fact of power does not entail the right to command, because God is perfectly good. Now we have made God's goodness the ground of obligation, but this means we are appealing to a standard of goodness independent of God's will, which defeats the purpose of divine command theory. Plato had seen this problem 2,000 years earlier in the Euthyphro dialogue. Is something good because God commands it, or does God command it because it is good? If the former, then morality is arbitrary, whatever God happened to decree. If the latter, then goodness exists independent of God's will, and we have not really grounded morality in divine command at all. Hume's contemporary, the Scottish philosopher William Wollaston, had tried to ground morality in truth and falsehood. An immoral action, Wollaston argued, is one that denies or misrepresents truth. Theft denies the truth of property rights. Murder denies the truth of human dignity. Hume found this reasoning confused. You cannot derive the wrongness of an action from its relationship to truth. That someone's action misrepresents reality might be a descriptive fact, but why ought we to avoid such misrepresentation? You need a prior normative premise that truth ought to be respected, that reality ought to be acknowledged, and that premise cannot itself be derived from facts about truth and falsehood. The intellectual crisis was profound. Enlightenment thinkers had largely abandoned revealed religion as a foundation for ethics, seeking instead to ground morality in reason and nature. Natural law provided the bridge, the way to move from the empirical world to moral truth without appealing to scripture or religious authority. Hume had pulled away the bridge. If you cannot derive aught from is, if observation of nature cannot yield moral imperatives, then the entire project of secular natural law ethics collapses. Some of Hume's contemporaries simply did not grasp what he had done. The paragraph in the treatise was brief, almost a passing observation. Hume himself did not dwell on it or develop its implications at length. The full force of the is-ought problem would not be felt for generations, but once philosophers began to understand what Hume had shown, the reverberations were inescapable. Morality could not be read from nature. It could not be deduced from divine command without begging the question. The great edifice of natural law, which had seemed to provide objective moral truth, grounded in the structure of reality itself, now appeared to rest on hidden normative assumptions that could not be justified by the facts of nature alone. You could describe human nature exhaustively, catalogue every capacity and tendency, map every natural inclination, and you would still not have established a single ought. The evaluative dimension required something more, something that mere description could never provide. The collapse of natural law ethics left a void. If we cannot derive morality from nature or divine command, where does morality come from? This question would drive moral philosophy for the next 2 centuries. For more than a century and a half after Hume wrote that brief paragraph in the treatise, philosophers debated his claims about moral sentiment and the limits of reason, but few grasped the full logical force of what he had identified. The is-ought divide remained more of an interesting observation than a fundamental problem in moral philosophy. That changed decisively in 1903, when a 30-year-old Cambridge philosopher named George Edward Moore published a book that would reframe Hume's insight with surgical precision and devastating consequences. Principia Ethica did not just revive the is-ought problem, it sharpened it, generalized it, and made it impossible to ignore. Moore was an unlikely revolutionary. Born in 1873 to middle-class parents in London, he spent most of his career at Cambridge, where his careful analytical style and almost painful intellectual honesty made him a central figure in early analytic philosophy. He possessed no particular flair for rhetoric, and his prose could be relentlessly dry. But what More lacked in stylistic elegance, he compensated for with logical clarity. When he identified a philosophical error, he dissected it with the methodical precision of a surgeon removing a tumor. In Principia Ethica, the tumor he identified was what he called the naturalistic fallacy, and nearly every moral philosopher of the previous 2,000 years stood accused of committing it. The naturalistic fallacy, as More defined it, is the mistake of trying to define the word good in terms of any natural property. By natural property, More meant any property you could observe or measure in the world, anything belonging to the domain of empirical fact. Philosophers throughout history had attempted to define goodness as pleasure, or as what promotes human survival, or as what fulfills human nature, or as what evolution selected for. More argued that every single one of these attempts failed for the same fundamental reason. Goodness, he insisted, is a simple, unanalyzable quality that cannot be reduced to anything else. To demonstrate this, More deployed what has become known as the open question argument, a piece of philosophical reasoning so elegant and troubling that it continues to provoke debate more than a century later. The argument works like this. Take any proposed naturalistic definition of good. Suppose someone says that good means produces pleasure, or good means promotes survival, or good means whatever most people approve of. Now ask yourself whether this question makes sense. I know that this thing produces pleasure, but is it good? Or I know that this promotes survival, but is it good? If the proposed definition were correct, these questions would be nonsensical, like asking, I know that this man is unmarried, but is he a bachelor? The answer would be contained in the definition itself. But the questions are not nonsensical. They remain open. You can coherently ask whether pleasure is good, whether survival is good, whether popular approval tracks goodness. The very fact that these remain genuine questions, More argued, proves that good cannot be defined in terms of pleasure, survival, approval, or any other natural property. Each proposed definition leaves conceptual space between the natural property and goodness itself. That space, that persistent gap, is the naturalistic fallacy made visible. What made More's formulation so powerful was its generality. Hume had pointed out that you cannot derive aught from is, but his argument was embedded in his specific views about moral sentiment and the limits of reason. More extracted the logical skeleton and showed that the problem applied to any attempt to reduce goodness to natural properties, regardless of your broader philosophical commitments. You could be a rationalist or an empiricist, a religious believer or a secular naturalist, and you would still face the open question argument. The naturalistic fallacy was not tied to one school of thought. It threatened all of them. More went further still. He argued that the naturalistic fallacy applied not just to definitions of good in terms of natural properties, but to any definition of good whatsoever. Even defining good in terms of metaphysical properties, like God's will or the form of the good in Plato's heaven, fell prey to the same problem. You could always coherently ask, I know that God wills this, but is it good? The open question remained open. Goodness, More concluded, is simply indefinable. It is a primitive concept, something we know directly through a kind of moral intuition, but cannot analyze further. The implications were staggering. If More was right, then moral philosophy had been making a fundamental category error for millennia. Ethicists had been trying to define goodness the way you might define triangle or bachelor, by breaking it down into component parts or relating it to other concepts. But goodness is not that kind of thing. It is more like yellowness, a simple quality that you either perceive or you do not. You cannot explain yellow to someone who has never seen it, and you cannot explain good to someone who lacks the capacity for moral intuition. All you can do is point. More himself was a moral realist who believed that moral truths existed objectively, independent of human opinion or feeling. But his argument about the naturalistic fallacy created a profound problem for moral realism. If goodness cannot be defined in natural terms, and if natural properties are all that science investigates, then how can we have knowledge of goodness? How do moral truths relate to the natural world? More's answer involved a special faculty of moral intuition, but this struck many philosophers as mysterious and unsatisfying, a placeholder rather than an explanation. The difference between Hume's version of the problem and More's is subtle but significant. Hume focused on the logical gap between descriptive statements and prescriptive conclusions. His point was about the structure of valid inference. You cannot get an ought in your conclusion if you do not have an ought somewhere in your premises. More shifted the focus to the meaning of moral terms themselves. His point was about definition and conceptual analysis. You cannot define good in non-moral terms without changing the subject. Both arguments point to a gap between fact and value, but they approach that gap from different angles, and they have different implications for how we understand moral language. More's formulation dominated Anglo-American moral philosophy for the first half of the 20th century. Philosophers might disagree about whether More was right, but they could not ignore him. The naturalistic fallacy became a standard objection, something any moral philosopher had to address. If you wanted to ground ethics in human nature, in evolution, in social contract, in divine command, in anything at all, you had to explain how you were avoiding More's trap. Some philosophers tried to refine their definitions to escape the open question argument. Others challenged More's assumption that goodness must be definable at all. Still others embraced the gap between fact and value and drew increasingly radical conclusions about the nature of moral discourse. What More had done, whether he fully intended it or not, was to make the is-ought problem unavoidable. Hume had opened the door. More removed the hinges. After Principia Ethica, moral philosophy could no longer proceed as if the fact-value distinction were a minor technicality. It was the central problem, the defining challenge. Every ethical theory would have to take a stand on whether and how it could be bridged. More's work crystallized the is-ought problem for a new generation, but it also provoked fierce resistance. Throughout the 20th century, philosophers developed increasingly sophisticated strategies to bridge, bypass, or dissolve Hume's guillotine. More's work crystallized the is-ought problem for a new generation, but it also provoked fierce resistance. Throughout the 20th century, philosophers developed increasingly sophisticated strategies to bridge, bypass, or dissolve Hume's guillotine. Yet some philosophers took a different path entirely. Rather than trying to solve the problem, they embraced it and followed its implications to their most radical conclusions. What if Hume and More were not just right, but more right than even they realized? What if moral statements were not just distinct from factual statements, but were not really statements at all? This question animated a group of philosophers who gathered in Vienna in the 1920s. The Vienna Circle, as they became known, were intoxicated by the success of modern science and modern logic. They believed philosophy had been plagued for centuries by meaningless pseudo-problems created by confused language. Their mission was to cleanse philosophy, to establish once and for all which sentences were meaningful and which were merely grammatically correct nonsense masquerading as profundity. Their weapon was the verification principle. A sentence, they argued, is meaningful only if it can be verified through observation or if it is true by definition, like a mathematical or logical truth. The statement, "water boils at 100 degrees Celsius at sea level," is meaningful because you can verify it through observation. The statement, "all bachelors are unmarried," is meaningful because it is true by definition. But what about the statement, "stealing is wrong"? You cannot verify it through observation. You can observe someone stealing, observe the consequences, observe people's reactions, but you cannot observe wrongness itself, floating in the air like a property you might measure with instruments. Nor is stealing is wrong true by definition in the way that all bachelors are unmarried is true by definition. The concept of stealing does not contain the concept of wrongness in its very meaning. The conclusion seemed inescapable. Moral statements are not meaningful in the same way factual statements are meaningful. They do not describe reality. They do not state facts. They appear to have the grammatical structure of statements, but this is an illusion. When you say stealing is wrong, you are not making a claim about the world that could be true or false. You are doing something else entirely. Alfred Jules Ayer, a precocious young British philosopher who spent time with the Vienna Circle, published Language, Truth and Logic in 1936 when he was just 25 years old. The book was a manifesto of logical positivism written with the confidence and clarity of youth. Ayer's chapter on ethics was devastatingly simple. Moral statements, he argued, are not statements at all. They are expressions of emotion dressed up as propositions. When you say stealing is wrong, according to Ayer, you are not describing a moral fact. You are expressing your disapproval of stealing. It is as if you said stealing and then made a disapproving face, or said stealing, boo. The sentence has the grammatical appearance of a factual claim, but its actual function is emotive. It expresses feeling and, crucially, attempts to evoke similar feelings in others. This view became known as emotivism, and it represented the most radical acceptance of Hume's guillotine imaginable. If you cannot derive ought from is, perhaps that is because ought statements are not the kind of thing that can be derived at all. They are not in the business of being true or false. They are in the business of expressing and influencing attitudes. Ayer's emotivism was clean and brutal, and it provoked immediate outrage. Critics accused him of reducing morality to mere subjective preference, of making moral disagreement ultimately irrational, of implying that Hitler's genocide is wrong and Hitler's genocide is right, were equally valid expressions of feeling with no possible rational arbitration between them. Ayer's response was characteristically unflinching. Yes, moral disagreements cannot be resolved by appeal to moral facts, because there are no moral facts. But this does not mean all moral positions are equal. It simply means that moral argument is about changing attitudes, not discovering truths. Charles Leslie Stevenson, an American philosopher, developed a more sophisticated version of emotivism in his 1944 book, Ethics and Language. Stevenson recognized that moral language is more complex than Ayer's simple emotive exclamations suggested. When you say stealing is wrong, you are not just venting emotion. You are trying to persuade, to influence, to shape behavior and attitudes. Moral language has what Stevenson called emotive meaning, alongside descriptive meaning. Consider the difference between saying John redistributes wealth and John steals. Both might describe the same action, but they have radically different emotive meanings. One suggests approval, the other condemnation. For Stevenson, this emotive dimension was not a distortion of language, but its essential moral function. Moral disagreements are disagreements in attitude, not disagreements about facts, though factual disagreements can certainly cause or resolve attitudinal disagreements. Stevenson's analysis captured something important about how moral language actually works. When you argue about abortion or capital punishment, you marshal facts, but the facts themselves do not settle the question. Two people can agree on all the facts and still disagree morally because they have different attitudes, different emotional responses, different priorities. The emotivists seem to be describing something real about moral discourse. Yet the cultural reaction was fierce. Emotivism seemed to strip morality of its authority, to reduce profound moral convictions to matters of taste. If saying murder is wrong is just expressing disapproval, how is it different from saying, I don't like Brussels sprouts? The emotivists had answers to these objections, but the answers never fully satisfied. There seemed to be a gap between the emotivists' theory of moral language and the phenomenology of moral experience, the felt sense that morality makes demands on us that transcend our feelings. The challenge emotivism posed was deeper than its critics sometimes recognized. If moral claims are not fact-stating, what rational constraints govern moral discourse? Can moral argument be anything more than sophisticated manipulation? Is there any sense in which one moral view can be better than another, not just more popular or more effectively argued, but actually better? The emotivists had dismantled the illusion that morality could be grounded in facts, but they had not yet shown what, if anything, could take the place of that grounding. Emotivism's radical embrace of the fact-value distinction troubled many philosophers. Could there really be no rational basis for morality? The second half of the 20th century saw a wave of attempts to restore objectivity to ethics without falling into the naturalistic fallacy. The radical conclusions of emotivism left many philosophers deeply uncomfortable. If moral statements were merely expressions of feeling, no more factual than saying hooray, then ethics seemed to collapse into pure subjectivity. The project of finding rational grounds for morality appeared dead, but philosophy rarely accepts defeat gracefully. Beginning in the 1960s, a new generation of thinkers launched ambitious attempts to bridge Hume's divide, or at least to show that the gap was not as unbridgeable as it seemed. The most audacious challenge came from John Searle in 1964, just as the linguistic turn in philosophy was reaching its height. Searle, then a young professor at Berkeley, published a paper with the provocative title, "How to Derive Ought from Is." The very title was a gauntlet thrown down. Searle claimed he could do what Hume said was impossible, derive a genuine ought statement from purely descriptive premises, with no hidden normative assumptions smuggled in. His argument centered on what he called institutional facts. Consider, Searle said, the following chain of reasoning. Jones utters the words, "I hereby promise to pay you $5. This is a simple descriptive fact. From this fact, it follows that Jones has promised to pay $5. From the fact that he has promised, it follows that Jones has placed himself under an obligation. And from the fact that he is under an obligation, it follows that Jones ought to pay the $5. There, Searle announced, ought derived from is. The philosophical response was immediate and fierce. Critics pounced on the argument from every angle. The most obvious objection was that Searle had not started with pure descriptive facts at all. The very institution of promising is already normative. When we say Jones has made a promise, we are not just describing sounds emanating from his mouth. We are invoking an institution that comes loaded with obligations and normative expectations. The word promise already contains an ought hidden inside it. Searle had not bridged the gap so much as disguised how he crossed it. Searle defended himself vigorously, arguing that the institution of promising can be described in purely factual terms as a set of social practices and conventions. But this defense raised further questions. Even if we can describe the institution of promising factually, why should Jones care about following its rules? Why does the existence of a social practice create a genuine obligation? To answer these questions, we seem to need normative premises about the importance of social institutions, about consistency, about the value of trust. The ought keeps reappearing, like a ghost that cannot be banished. The debate over Searle's argument continues. Some philosophers find it illuminating, others find it question-begging, but almost everyone agrees that, even if Searle succeeded, he succeeded only for a very narrow class of institutional obligations. He did not show how to derive ought from, is in the broad sense Hume's problem demands. He did not show how to get from facts about human biology or psychology to conclusions about justice, compassion, or human rights. A different strategy emerged from Oxford in the 1970s and 80s, led by the philosopher Philippa Foot. Foot was dissatisfied with both emotivism's subjectivism and Searle's narrow focus on institutions. She proposed returning to a much older tradition, Aristotelian virtue ethics, but she wanted to give it a naturalistic foundation that might bypass Hume's guillotine altogether. The key to Foot's approach was the concept of natural goodness. Consider how we evaluate living things. When we say a wolf has good eyesight or that an oak tree has a healthy root system, we are making normative judgments, but they seem to be grounded in facts about the organism's nature and its life form. A good wolf is one that exemplifies the characteristics necessary for the wolf to flourish as the kind of creature it is. Goodness in this context is tied to function and flourishing. It is both descriptive and normative at once. Foot proposed extending this model to human beings. Human beings, like wolves and oak trees, have a characteristic form of life. We have certain natural capacities and needs. A good human being, then, is one who flourishes according to human nature, who develops and exercises the capacities distinctive to our species: rationality, sociability, the ability to form deep attachments, to plan for the future, to create and appreciate meaning. Virtues like courage, temperance, and justice are not arbitrary social conventions. They are characteristics necessary for human flourishing, grounded in facts about what kind of creatures we are. This neo-Aristotelian approach was developed further by philosophers like Alasdair MacIntyre, Rosalind Hursthouse, and Michael Thompson. It offered an attractive middle path. It grounded ethics in nature without committing the crudest forms of the naturalistic fallacy. It made room for objective moral truth without appealing to divine command or mysterious non-natural properties, and it restored the connection between ethics and human psychology that emotivism had severed. But Hume's guillotine still glinted in the background. Critics asked, even if we can describe human nature factually, and even if we can identify the characteristics that promote human flourishing, why ought we to flourish? Why is flourishing good? A sociopath might be perfectly aware of what human flourishing involves, and still ask, with perfect logical coherence, why he should care about it. To move from flourishing promotes these capacities, to therefore you ought to flourish, we seem to need a normative premise that flourishing is good, that you ought to develop your natural capacities, and that premise cannot be derived from the facts alone. The Neo-Aristotelians responded that this objection misunderstands how normative concepts work. When we grasp what kind of thing a human being is, we simultaneously grasp the standards appropriate to evaluating humans. The facts are not value-free atoms from which we then derive values. The facts themselves, properly understood, are already laden with evaluative content. To describe human nature is already to invoke standards of better and worse. This response has convinced some philosophers, but left others unmoved. It seems to deny Hume's fundamental insight about the logical distinction between description and prescription. Even if our language about nature is evaluatively thick, even if we cannot describe human life without invoking standards, the question remains, why are those standards binding? Why ought we to conform to them? A related family of moral realist positions has emerged in recent decades, arguing that some facts are inherently normative. These philosophers, including Derek Parfit, Thomas Nagel, and Russ Schaefer-Landau, claim that certain truths about reasons, values, or obligations are simply basic features of reality, not reducible to natural facts, but not supernatural either. The fact that suffering is bad, for instance, is not derived from non-normative facts. It is itself a fundamental normative fact, as basic as any fact of mathematics or logic. This view avoids the naturalistic fallacy by denying that moral facts need to be derived from non-moral facts at all. Moral truths are simply among the truths there are, but it raises new questions. How do we know these irreducible normative facts? What gives them their authority over us? And have we really solved Hume's problem, or merely relocated it? Instead of asking how to derive ought from is, we are now asking why these irreducible oughts matter, why they should motivate us. The gap between fact and motivation remains. Each of these sophisticated responses to Hume represents genuine philosophical progress. They have deepened our understanding of normativity, enriched our moral vocabulary, and shown that the landscape of the is-ought problem is more complex than it first appears. Yet none has achieved consensus. Each remains contested, vulnerable to counterarguments, unable to fully dissolve the problem Hume identified. The divide between is and ought continues to resist closure. Despite these sophisticated attempts, Hume's guillotine has never been definitively overcome. This persistence suggests something deep about the structure of moral thought itself. You would think that after 2.5 centuries of philosophical scrutiny, someone would have found a way to diffuse Hume's guillotine. The problem has been reformulated, reframed, and rigorously analyzed by some of the finest minds in the history of philosophy. Solutions have been proposed, defended in journal articles, debated at conferences, taught in graduate seminars. Yet the is-ought problem persists with a stubborn vitality that suggests we are dealing with something more fundamental than a mere puzzle waiting for the right logical key. The pattern repeats itself with remarkable consistency. A philosopher proposes what appears to be a decisive solution, one that finally bridges the gap between fact and value. The solution gains adherence, generates excitement, becomes the subject of sympathetic commentary. Then, gradually or suddenly, other philosophers identify the hidden normative premise, smuggled into what was supposed to be a purely factual derivation. The guillotine blade falls again. What looked like a bridge turns out to be a pontoon floating on unacknowledged values. Consider John Searle's institutional facts argument from the 1960s. Searle thought he could derive an ought from an is by way of social institutions and speech acts. If Jones promises to pay Smith $5, he argued, then Jones is obligated to pay Smith $5. The obligation seems to follow from the fact of promising itself, but critics quickly pointed out that this derivation only works if you already accept that one ought to keep promises, or that institutional facts create genuine obligations. The normative force does not emerge from the descriptive facts alone. It was there all along, embedded in our understanding of what promising means and why it matters. Searle had not bridged the gap so much as re-described it. Or take the neo-Aristotelian naturalists who ground ethics in facts about human flourishing, the characteristic function of human beings. Philippa Foot and her intellectual descendants argue that moral evaluations work like functional evaluations in biology. Just as a good heart is one that pumps blood efficiently, a good human being is one who exercises the distinctively human capacities well. This seems promising until you ask why we should care about flourishing in the first place, or why the characteristic functions of human nature should be normatively binding. Evolution produced our capacities through blind processes that had no moral aims. Why should the products of natural selection tell us how to live? The moment you make that move from biological function to moral obligation, you have crossed the Azot divide, whether you acknowledge it or not. The problem resurfaces because there is something structurally different between descriptive and prescriptive discourse, between statements about how things are and statements about how things should be. Descriptive statements aim to represent the world accurately. Their success conditions are truth and falsity, correspondence to reality. Prescriptive statements, by contrast, do not merely describe but evaluate, recommend, command. They possess what philosophers call motivational force, the capacity to move us toward action. This motivational dimension cannot be extracted from descriptive content alone, no matter how complete your factual description becomes. You could know every physical fact about the universe, every truth expressible in the language of chemistry and physics and biology and neuroscience, and still face the question of what you ought to do with that knowledge. The facts constrain morality, certainly. They tell us what is possible, what actions will have what consequences, what beings can suffer and flourish, but constraints are not directives. The step from this action will cause suffering to therefore do not perform this action requires a normative premise that suffering is bad and should be avoided. That premise is not itself a scientific discovery. This is why neuroscience, for all its genuine insights into human decision-making and moral psychology, cannot tell us how to live. Brain imaging studies can show us which neural circuits activate when people make moral judgments, how emotional and cognitive processes interact, which brain regions are involved in empathy and fairness reasoning. This knowledge is fascinating and valuable. It deepens our understanding of the mechanisms underlying moral cognition. But mechanism is not justification. Discovering that a particular pattern of neural activation accompanies the judgment that stealing is wrong does not tell us whether stealing actually is wrong. The neuroscience describes what happens when we make moral judgments. It does not validate the judgments themselves. The distinction between moral realism and anti-realism turns largely on how philosophers respond to this predicament. Moral realists believe there are objective moral truths independent of what anyone thinks or feels about them. But if Hume is right, these truths cannot be discovered through empirical observation or derived from natural facts. They must exist in some other domain, accessible through moral intuition or rational insight, or perhaps constitutive of practical reason itself. Anti-realists, by contrast, accept that moral judgments do not describe an independent moral reality. For them, the Azot gap confirms that ethics is fundamentally different from science, grounded in human practices, sentiments or conventions rather than objective facts. Contemporary debates in bioethics and political philosophy repeatedly run up against the Azot divide. When we argue about the moral status of embryos, we cannot resolve the question by appealing only to biological facts about when life begins or when consciousness emerges. Those facts matter, but they gain moral significance only within a framework of prior normative commitments about what kinds of beings have moral status and why. When we debate economic inequality, empirical data about wealth distribution and social outcomes inform the discussion. but they do not by themselves determine whether inequality is unjust. That determination requires normative premises about fairness, desert, and the requirements of human dignity. The problem will not go away because it reflects a genuine feature of moral thought. Moral deliberation is not failed science, waiting for better data. It is a distinctive human activity that involves facts but is never reducible to them. We bring values to our engagement with the world, values that shape how we interpret facts and what we do with our knowledge. These values can be criticized, revised, improved through reflection and dialogue, but they cannot be eliminated from moral reasoning without eliminating morality itself. Perhaps this is what Hume understood in that brief paragraph. Even if he did not fully articulate its implications, morality occupies its own space in human life, connected to facts about human nature and the world but not derived from them. The is-ought gap is not a defect to be repaired, but a boundary to be respected. It marks the limit of what reason and observation can achieve without the addition of evaluative judgment, personal commitment, and the willingness to say not just what is, but what matters. The persistence of the is-ought problem is not a failure of philosophy, but a feature of moral thought. It reveals something essential about the human condition and how we navigate between facts and values. The persistence of Hume's guillotine across nearly 3 centuries suggests something profound. Perhaps the problem will not go away because it should not go away. Perhaps the unbridgeable divide between is and ought is not a defect in our reasoning, but a feature of moral life itself, one that we need to understand rather than overcome. When you acknowledge the fact-value distinction, you gain clarity about what moral thinking actually involves. You recognize that moral judgment is not a form of sophisticated observation, not a way of detecting ethical particles in the universe or reading purposes from nature's blueprint. Instead, moral thinking becomes visible as a distinctively human activity, one that requires something beyond perception and logic. It requires evaluation, commitment, and choice. This recognition does not diminish morality. It clarifies what morality is and why it matters in ways that facts alone cannot capture. Consider what happens when we pretend the guillotine does not exist, when we convince ourselves that values flow smoothly from facts. The history of this pretense is not reassuring. When people claim to derive moral conclusions directly from nature, they almost always smuggle in the values they wish to justify. The eugenics movement of the early 20th century offered a chilling example. Proponents claimed that scientific facts about heredity and evolution directly implied moral conclusions about who should reproduce. But the move from genetic observations to sterilization policies required normative premises about human worth, social good, and legitimate state power, premises that were assumed rather than derived. The appearance of scientific inevitability made these moral choices invisible, which made them all the more dangerous. Similar patterns appear throughout intellectual history. Social Darwinists claim that observations about natural selection justified laissez-faire economics and social hierarchy. Racists claimed that alleged biological differences between populations implied moral hierarchies. Behaviorists claimed that facts about conditioning and reinforcement determined how we ought to raise children and structure society. In each case, the appeal to facts served to disguise moral choices as natural necessities, to transform contestable values into scientific conclusions beyond debate. The danger is not merely academic. When you believe your moral positions flow inevitably from facts, you close off moral argument before it begins. Why debate values if values are really just facts in disguise? Why engage in moral persuasion if morality is a matter of correct observation rather than reflective judgment? The is-ought divide keeps moral discourse open by reminding us that moral conclusions always require moral premises, that values must be argued for rather than simply read off from nature or deduced from observations. How then does moral philosophy proceed if Hume was right? Not by abandoning reason or embracing arbitrary emotivism, but by recognizing the distinctive character of moral reasoning. Moral philosophy becomes the attempt to articulate, examine, and refine our normative commitments, to achieve what John Rawls called reflective equilibrium, a coherent fit between our considered moral judgments, the principles that might justify them, and the background theories that inform our understanding. This process involves moving back and forth between levels of moral thinking. You begin with particular moral intuitions. It is wrong to torture children for entertainment. Promises create obligations. Justice requires treating similar cases similarly. You then seek more general principles that might explain and systematize these intuitions. Respect for persons, fidelity to commitments, impartiality. But you also test these principles against new cases and against each other, revising both intuitions and principles to achieve greater coherence. The method is not deductive in the way that rationalist philosophers hoped. You do not start with self-evident axioms and derive all moral truths through pure reason, but neither is it arbitrary or purely subjective. The process of seeking reflective equilibrium involves genuine reasoning, identifying inconsistencies, drawing out implications, considering objections, testing principles against cases, and refining views in light of new considerations. It is reasoning within morality rather than reasoning to morality from non-moral premises. Coherence plays a crucial role here, but not as a sufficient foundation for morality. Rather, coherence serves as a constraint and guide for moral thinking. If your moral beliefs contradict each other or lead to absurd conclusions, that gives you reason to revise them. If one principle illuminates and systematizes a wide range of moral judgments while another introduces ad hoc complications, that counts in favor of the first. But coherence operates within a space already populated by moral commitments, not as a neutral procedure for generating values from nothing. The is-ought problem, understood this way, does not paralyze moral philosophy. It redirects it. Instead of seeking foundations in non-moral facts, moral philosophers articulate the structure of moral thinking, clarify the implications of moral commitments, and explore how different values fit or conflict with each other. They examine what different ways of life require and enable, what different principles demand in practice, what virtues particular forms of human flourishing involve. All of this is genuine intellectual work that requires rigor, imagination, and careful reasoning. You might think that accepting Hume's guillotine makes moral discourse less important, that if values cannot be derived from facts, then moral debate becomes mere expression of preference. But the opposite is true. The fact-value distinction makes moral discourse more important precisely because it shows that moral questions cannot be settled by observation and logic alone. If moral conclusions followed automatically from facts, moral discussion would be unnecessary, a task for scientists rather than citizens. But because values require justification in distinctively moral terms, because we must argue about what matters and why, moral discourse becomes an indispensable part of human life. This is why philosophy after Hume has not abandoned normative ethics, but intensified it. Contemporary philosophers continue to develop sophisticated theories of justice, virtue, rights, and well-being. They argue about whether consequences alone determine rightness, whether certain actions are wrong regardless of outcomes, whether character matters more than conformity to rules. These debates proceed not by discovering new moral facts, but by clarifying concepts, testing principles against cases, examining implications, and seeking the most defensible account of moral life. The is-ought problem reminds us that this work is irreducibly normative, that it requires taking positions that facts alone cannot compel, but that does not make it arbitrary. Moral thinking, like mathematical thinking or aesthetic judgment, has its own standards of rigor and its own forms of rational justification, even though it cannot be reduced to empirical observation or logical deduction from non-normative premises. We close where we began, with the recognition that morality occupies a distinctive space in human life, not reducible to facts, but not therefore arbitrary or meaningless. But not everyone finds these defenses persuasive. A significant number of contemporary philosophers argue that sufficient reason, far from being indispensable to thought, is an optional and perhaps dangerous assumption. They point to quantum mechanics, where particles appear to decay without sufficient reason for the precise moment of decay. They point to mathematical set theory, where the axiom of choice allows for results that seem to defy rational explanation. They point to consciousness, personal identity, and ethical value as domains where explanation may reach natural limits, not because of our ignorance, but because of the nature of what is being explained. Some philosophers limit the principle's scope rather than rejecting it entirely. They accept sufficient reason for physical causation, but deny it applies to abstract objects or metaphysical necessities. Others accept it for truths of reason, but reject it for contingent existence. Still others argue the principle functions regionally, useful in science and everyday reasoning, but inappropriate for ultimate metaphysical questions. This position has the virtue of preserving what seems valuable about sufficient reason without committing to its most ambitious and problematic applications. The debate extends into philosophy of science, where it takes a more concrete form. When scientists construct theories, are they explaining why things happen or merely describing how things happen? If an electron decays at a particular moment, does quantum mechanics explain this, or merely assign it a probability? The dispute is not about scientific practice, but about what counts as explanation. Scientists themselves divide on this question. Some insist that science reveals the reasons things happen. Others argue that science only models patterns, that talk of explanation smuggles in metaphysical assumptions. Physics neither needs nor supports. In philosophy of religion, the principle continues to shape debates about God's existence. New versions of the cosmological argument appear regularly, each attempting to show that the existence of contingent reality demands a necessary being as its explanation. Critics respond with equal vigor, arguing that these arguments merely push the mystery back one step, that calling God a necessary being does not explain why necessary beings should exist, and that accepting one brute fact, the universe itself, is more parsimonious than accepting a different brute fact, God, to explain it. The debate never quite resolves because it hinges on whether you find brute facts acceptable or whether you believe explanation must go all the way down. But perhaps the most interesting implications are practical rather than theoretical. The demand for reasons shapes human life in ways we rarely acknowledge. We expect reasons for political decisions, for moral claims, for scientific assertions. We teach children to ask why and praise them for curiosity. We structure legal systems on the assumption that actions have reasons and that understanding those reasons matters for judgment. We conduct therapy by helping people understand the reasons for their feelings and behaviors. The entire edifice of modern rational culture rests on an assumption that reasons exist and that finding them improves human life. Yet, we also encounter limits. Sometimes explanations give out, not because we lack information, but because the question admits no answer. Why do you love this person rather than another? Why does this piece of music move you? Why do you find meaning in this activity and not that one? We can offer partial reasons, but they never quite capture the full reality. And sometimes the demand for reasons itself becomes oppressive, a refusal to accept that some aspects of existence simply are, that not everything requires justification, that relentless interrogation can destroy rather than illuminate. The fundamental question remains what it has always been. Is the universe ultimately intelligible? Is there a reason for everything? Or do reasons terminate in brute facts that admit no further explanation? Leibniz believed intelligibility went all the way down. Schopenhauer believed it stopped at the will. Contemporary defenders of sufficient reason argue we cannot coherently think otherwise. Contemporary critics argue we must accept limits or embrace incoherence. Neither side has won. Neither side can win, perhaps, because the debate is not really about evidence or logic, but about what we are willing to accept as an answer. The principle asks whether we live in a universe that makes sense through and through, or one that, at bottom, simply is. Whether you find that thought comforting or terrifying likely determines which side you take. The principle of sufficient reason remains what it has always been, not just a technical claim about explanation, but a referendum on the nature of reality itself. Whether you accept it or reject it, you cannot escape the question it poses.